Sure.
That was me. Sorry, it's Matt from IUA. I just wanted to ask you a question. I've done a bit of work with RavenDB, and just one of the things you didn't mention, just those concepts of base and ACID,
Yes.
is that RavenDB does try to bridge the gap there. Just for, I thought I should mention it for people who are looking for a solution like that. It does support transactions and registers on the DTC. That was one of the really interesting things about it. But the question I actually had was, with MongoDB, when we were first looking at this, the documentation was poor.
Yeah.
And RavenDB sits on top of Lucene, which is great for full text. So
Yes.
that's a really good application of NoSQL. What does Lucene sit on? I mean, is it a good, could you use it as a search engine layer?
Lucene, and we're just starting to play around in that space, is generally used as as some sort of knowledge gathering, being able to extract large amounts of information from this particular point and process them in parallel. So it is essentially a Java engine that has massive parallel processing capabilities. I haven't seen, we haven't really played with it a huge amount in terms of the actual Lucene engine, but I've seen it used extensively in Solr. So the Solr searches are used on top of Lucene. But it certainly isn't a space that we've got into a huge amount at the moment.
But things like FullText Search, I mean, that's easy with SQL Server. I know Raven on top of Lucene, it's easy. Does Manga support that type of very fast full-text query, or is it not the right software for that?
FullText Search, probably not. Okay. I would say that we would probably have to do some sort of background processing to figure out what we were going to do and how we were going to do it. I probably wouldn't have used FullText Search. On the project that we've worked on, we would probably have been looking at Solr. I'm not excited about SQL's full-text search at all. It's not the greatest capabilities, but Solr would probably give you much more flexibility. You're able to rank the searches, you're able to weight certain searches, and so you've got more of a Google-type experience using Solr than you do having SQL full-text search. I really couldn't talk to getting into the nuts of what a Lucene would actually give you. Yeah. All right. Matt, that's an awesome question, actually. Do you want to grab a beer? Well, how about we pass that down. Anybody got any other questions?
Sorry, Chris.
Yeah.
Where would you see an ORM sitting with MongoDB in this instance?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a very good question. No ORM. I don't see an object relational mapper at all. If you have a look at that, it's a serialized object. There are no ORMs, and this is one of the powers of using a MongoDB, and why the companies that lean and start and get get software into the industry quite quickly they reach for it because the ORM is that impedance between getting from a relational thing into an object space. Some ORMs just do the quick and dirty. They take a table and they make it an object. EF's one of those, and it's relatively lightweight. But if you wanted to start creating an object that was very deep and powerful, and you had a very flat table structure, then you've got to start using things like Hibernate, which would give you the power and flexibility. When you go onto the Mongo space, you don't have that. You set up an object, you have a collection of objects, serialize them, push them into the database, and that's where you're going. There is some mapping. There is that mapping, as I said, in that factory class where you get the object, get the other object, combine them together because you're separating them as two different aggregates. There is some mapping that you could do there. But you can do that mapping by hand. It's not heavy.
So you could use like a Jackson-style parser to just generate a JSON object and then store that into the database.
Well, in that particular case, you saw the parser was actually built into the database. So you just had the object, you serialized it, you said, and in the background that was actually happening. You didn't have to worry about storing the data. You just said, here's an object. I didn't go through the entire demo. I was running out a little bit of time, but there is a class that you just say, this object, this field maps to that, this field maps to that, or it just does it by reflection. Just pulls it in, goes in from there. Does that make sense? Have I answered the question?
Yeah.
Cool. Varun.
Is there any way to enforce data integrity when inserting information For instance, the name column has to have some sort of value.
No. No. In fact, in the demo, what part of the demo that I wanted to show you where I did the Spider-Man comment was if you change the names from uppercase to lowercase, it'll create a new column for you. So even the column names you have to be fairly vigilant of. You have a junior developer who's a little bit overzealous and doesn't write the mapping class correctly, and then you go and put the map, then you write the mapper correctly, you're going to actually have 2 columns inside your database. So there aren't the rigors. There are none of those rigors around the system. So you've got to be careful. You've got to, as I said, this is not the solution for every single problem. You know, where you want the rigor and you want the data structure and you want to be able to enforce these this integrity. You've got to start reaching for something that's a little bit more powerful, a little bit more suited to what you're looking for. Mongo's got that uber flexibility, but with that uber flexibility comes these things that can cut you. You know, can cut you hard. Yeah.
Sorry, another question. How about for you?
Yeah, I just want to be binary data storage.
Yes.
So, okay, with SQL Server, what you generally do is you have a record with a reference to another table that stores the binary data. So when you query it, you don't load all that,
Yes.
say a PDF document attached
Yes.
to a claim.
Yeah.
Is something like Manga quite efficient at storing a binary data object?
No, I didn't get into it, but Mongo has a separate type of data store. It's called GridFS, Grid File System. So it actually breaks the data up into small little chunks and actually spreads it out into its collections, and that would make sense because it's actually got to replicate the stuff across, and it doesn't want to replicate 200 gigs and wants to be able to move it efficiently. So yes, it is quite an efficient way to store the data inside a database. GridFS, it is there. I mean, we may have seen it while I was skipping through here. There it is. So it actually has some sort of file system, and as I said, breaks it up into small little pieces, pops them in there, and it allows you to be able to get the information in and out. Cool.
Just wanted to mention in Python because of the because it's also a very flexible type of typing system, flexi typing. It's very well suited for the Mongo sort of implementation, and there's been a couple of libraries that have, and to answer these two gentlemen, there's a couple of libraries that have risen from the ashes to a certain extent. One called Ming, which is really it aims to give you an ORM type of sort of SQL alchemy type of interface to interact with the Mongo database. Then you've also got something like Mongo Engine, which does the same, and you can actually set up your strict. The idea is to bring in some sort of control so that you don't create the duplicate columns, for example, or you want to check to make sure that you have got nothing more than a certain length, and that the information that's put in there is a valid type. It's useful also for things like creating automatic CRUDs.
Okay.
You want to make sure that the information is correct that the user's putting in. You don't want to necessarily create code in order to do that from outside, within the your views, for example. And you want to handle that within your model context. So just some interesting things on that regard. I'm very impressed with its replication functionality. I've experienced a couple of replication systems, and they're not pretty at all.
No.
Just for some understanding, is there any way, to set this up in a high availability type of setup? Is the library set supporting specifying the servers, or would you just use something like HA proxy or some sort to distribute the connection?
It's a good question. So what I'm going to start off with is by handing out some beers, because I've got to get rid of these guys. So that was a good question. And Varun asked a good question. Are you a beer drinker? All right. And there's another good question here. And some good input. Just a question for you before I get onto the HA question, because that is something I didn't touch on. That Ming class that you were talking about, Ming, does it sit over the database or does it sit inside your code?
It's a library abstraction, so it sits in your code.
In your code,
And
okay.
it'll provides like an interface to you design a schema set in your code base, and
Right.
you interact with those objects as though
Okay.
they're so when you interact with the object, you're interacting with MongoDB.
All right. Okay, I get it. So that's essentially a mantle that sits over and stops people from cutting themselves. It's really cool. It's like the sheath on the knife. Yeah. And the interesting thing here, guys, is that's open source. Like, look at the awesome stuff that's actually happening out in the open source world. And I encourage us to all get out there and actually start working in open source. I mean, I can't explain some of the solutions that we've had to go in and look at. And we've got no off-the-shelf solution. And I go to the open source world, and there it is. It's like some oak has hit this problem 17,000 times, and he's got a solution for me. I just think it's encouraging. And where there's a need, people actually create a hole and cover it up nicely. Coming back to your question, HA. So there is this concept inside Mongo, which is called the right concern. If you wanted some form of high availability system, you would have to set up a rule that said when you write, you can only commit back to the client that you've written the record when it's replicated to a certain number of slaves. So in your case of HA, there is a case for that, and you can say the minimum number is 5. It does slow down your inputs, so you can't just go into this fire and forget mode, which most people want to be able to get to, because that's where the speed comes into the system. You can fire off a request. In Mongo, you can do that, but then you can also sort of turn up this consistency concept and say, I want to set the right concern to 5, and it means that there's a certain number of servers, 5 in particular, that I need to actually have communicated with and replicated to before I commit that the transaction's been committed. All right, so that is the solution to the more high availability type of solution. Okay, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Sure.
And one other thing I want to ask, when it comes to large volumes of data, so I've worked with millions of records,
yeah,
and I'm wanting to aggregate information from those records, and I know you touched on a little bit on the indexing performance and stuff.
Yeah.
But when it comes with large data, big data specifically,
yeah,
you're wanting to you want to generate some useful reporting from it. When it comes to sort of I don't know if you've taken what our usual transactional SQL-based systems and converted to something like a Mongo-based environment. I mean, I can see an application, say for example, storing people's information. This seems very good for storing, like instead of using LDAP, use or directory database system using Mongo instead.
Yeah, good call.
So if for example I wanted to store all that information, I wanted to get a list of all the people, I want to count, say for example, and the number of people in certain areas, I got to deal with a couple of 100 million entries. Is Mongo good for a big data environments, or should I be using something more like Hadoop?
That's a very good question. All right, so big data, when we're talking big data, you're going to start to leverage off your Hadoop type systems, because they're able to process in parallel, and they're able to sort of map reduce large amounts of data into what you're looking at. If you're looking at a couple of million, then that's not big data. I mean, we're looking at like terabytes worth of data. You're then going to start moving into this Hadoop space. This is a space that we're just starting to get into at the moment. So I'm hoping that, I guess, by next year sometime we can come back and actually start talking a lot more about the parallel processing and this Hadoop space. What Mongo does have for you is it does have MapReduce inside it. Although I fear that it's actually going to hit a level where it can't cope with massive amounts of data. It might take a while to be able to get in there. So they have a concept where you can map. Does everybody know what MapReduce actually is? Right. So it's a concept that was created by Google. If you had a document with a whole heap of words on it, you would take all those words out and you were mapping the words to a document name, and then you would reduce them by finding the associated words from other documents and saying, I have a lookup for this word would happen in this document. So that's the map part, and then there's the reduce part. So when we talk about MapReduce, it's a two-phase process of mapping information and then reducing it to the essence of the reporting that we're looking for. And Google revolutionized this concept. In fact, that's what it's built on top of. it does have a MapReduce inside it. So you can actually say, this is the function grouped by this, map it like this, and have a JavaScript function that actually does all the mapping, says, and then have a reduce function, which is another JavaScript function, which will reduce the information, and either show it to screen, it can only do 16 megs if you're doing it that way, or write it to a collection, and then you can read it off the collection as a cached version of the output that you're looking at. But I don't think it's going to go into your terabytes. In fact, I know it's not going to go down that route. But it does have a way to extract the information out.
Just wanted to give you another example of the MapReduce. I actually saw it the other day, just, like an average. That's like the big one you always see with SQL Server. But the average, what it'll do is it'll store the total count, basically cached, and then the number of records. So it's got the average at all times. So like all of them, I don't know about Manga, but I know Raven's got inbuilt MapReduce functionality. So it will literally, as you said, it'll build those indexes or whatever, and just build the maps, and then the reducers will come stock standard out of it. But from what you're saying there, that replication, I was really interested in that too, because I've also come off the back end of a 9-month DR project, and I'm just finishing it with SQL Server, and I've had endless headaches, and that replication just looked amazing. I just wanted to ask you though, does that replicate? Can you replicate to multiple nodes there easily?
Yeah,
you did it up there.
I did two because it's easier to show two. Yeah. But you normally have to have an odd number of nodes so that the arbiter could actually figure out who the vote is going to go to when you need to have a primary go up, or you need to give it a vote, or you need to give certain servers more votes than others. You can do that. There's super powerful. I mean, I didn't get into all the stuff. We could probably spend a morning talking about replication. But you can go to more than one node. You could go to any number of nodes. And the nodes subscribe rather than the master knows about it. So it writes to its op list, and then the other node says, look, I've got up to this point in my op list, give me everything else that I need, and it brings it back down again. So yes, more than one node, many nodes.
Perfect DR solution, because if your primary goes down, you just start to point your clients to the...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's a perfect load balance solution as well. In your connection string to your application, you can say, go to this for your primary, go to these for your secondary. If primary is writing, I'll go back to my secondary to get my information from. Perfect load balance solution. But those are all the nuts and bolts. You've got to find the perfect business solution, and that's what I've got to caution you guys against. All right, guys, we're running really late, and I've been talking forever, and I know you guys have had some good questions. Thanks very much for attending this morning, and we hope to see you at the next one when we start talking about distributed systems. If I can just point out that you had a little piece of paper. Somebody mentioned that there would be a test. Yep, there's a little bit of a questionnaire. If you could fill it in for us, it's easier for us to do it here while we've got you, rather than send it to you and then...
In case you want to model answer, all the answers are 5, 5, 5. Yes, yes. Thank you.